is routing, client-side routing, and the other one is how I can do more advanced validation of forms when I create forms to collect data from users. First of all, the client-side routing. You know, a SPA application, we have a single page. A shell page gets loaded, and from that time onward, we never reload the whole page. The whole idea is whenever the user clicks another link, we only load the new component. We don't reload the whole page. So to facilitate this process of loading components in response to user clicking a link, there is a kind of a package that extends Vue.js, and this package is called the Vue router. So you can install it if you're using CLI. You can install it by default, or you can install it manually using npm install. And the idea is, for example, if the user visits /products, the product list component will be loaded. If the user, for example, visits /product/ a particular product, the product details components will be loaded. So the way it works is very simple, declarative way of defining routes. So what you do, first of all, you create an array, and this array maps the URLs to components. So what it says here, if the user visits /calculator, Vue.js should load the calculator component. If the user visits /heroes, the Vue.js should load the heroes component. So in here, declaratively, you map a URL or a kind of a relative URL to a component. That's all you do. So let me show you this concretely in our example. So here it is. Typically, we create a new file. Most people will call it a router.js. And in this file, what we do is we import these two libraries, the Vue.js and the router, and then we import all our components that we want to make available. We import them. And then we tell Vue.js, by the way, Vue.js, be aware that I am using this add-in to Vue.js because Vue.js is the base library. You can extend it with extra functionality. In this case, we are extending it with the router capabilities. So this is how I do it. I import the router, and I let Vue.js be aware of the router being used. And then this file will simply return a new instance of the router. And inside this new instance, I have one object, and this object is basically called the routes. And a routes is nothing but an array. You can see here an array, and each object in the array has two major properties. The first one is the relative URL path, which is assigned to the property path, and the component that will be loaded, which is assigned to the component property. So it's very straightforward. This type of templates, you use it in all type of projects. It's very simple. You import Vue and router. You let Vue.js be aware of the router, and then you export a new instance of the router. And this instance, you kind of configure the router. Here you are configuring the router. How do you configure the router? You define the routes of your application. And then when you run your app, if the user visits this component will be loaded. If the user visits /bulk, this component will be loaded, and so on. Now, this is the router configuration. Once the router is configured, now it's time to create hyperlinks for the user to visit and click those hyperlinks. So the way you create those hyperlinks is what you do is you use a special built-in tag that Vue.js provides and we call it here a router link. So instead of using the HTML A tag, I use here the router link tag, and then here I specify the to, which is the route I want to go to. So, and then it is as if I am defining an A tag. Remember the A tag to create a link? In A, if I use A tag, it will be A href equal the path, and then some text or label of the link, and then close the tag. So instead of using an anchor, I am using a router link element. So I do that for all the links that I want to make available to the user, and then the router will automatically load the component in a particular place. Where does it load it? I have to create here, I have to add this tag. It's like a placeholder. It's a place where the components will be loaded. So here I'll say router.-view, and basically, for example, if the user visits /calculator, what Vue.js will do, it will go and load the calculator component. And where it will load it? In this router view. So this is the whole story of using the view router. So basically, let's say two major steps. One is to configure the router by defining association between the relative path and the component. Second is to create the links. And these links are nothing but similar to an anchor link, but we use a router link rather than a tag. And then we create a placeholder where the component will be loaded. And this placeholder is named router.-view. Those are my links. And then when I click, the associated component is loaded. You can see here, this is one shell page. In the shell page, I have one main menu. And this menu, whenever I click the link, it's associated with a particular component, and the components will be loaded accordingly. So have a look here. In the URL, if you see here carefully, Vue.js router adds this hash in the URL. So this is a relative URL, and it is kind of a local in the client. It does not trigger the browser to go back to the server side. So there are two things you keep in mind. Here is the router, where I define all my route configurations, as I showed you. In app.view, have a look at what's going on here. What I'm doing here in the template, I am loading a component called navbar. Remember, when I click a link, I have to have a placeholder where the components will be loaded. This placeholder is defined by this special tag provided by Vue.js, which is called router/-view. This is where the component associated with the URL will be loaded. Now, in this navbar, see here it is a component. I can visit it, and I can see what's in that component. So this Bootstrap navigation bar using Bootstrap classes. And what I'm doing here, instead of using a tag to create the links, I'm using a router link to, this is the URL I am going to, and this is just a class nav link. This is the Bootstrap class. And here, this is the label of this link. I have the link /10/5. What are these 10/5? Those are parameters. Yes. So for me to be able to pass parameters in the URL, I have to say so. I have to configure the router to be aware of these parameters. So have a look at this. What I'm doing here in this router, in the path, I'm creating two parameters. The first one is named A, the second one is named B. I can call them whatever I wish, but here I call them A and B. And now when I click this link, 10 will be assigned to A, and 5 will be assigned to B. Now, which component will be loaded when I click this simple calculator? The simple calculator component. So if I click there, so what's happened here, what I'm doing here when the component loads, I read the parameter A from the route and assign it to the property A. And I read the parameter B from the route and assign it to the property B. So the way I read parameters coming from the route, I simply do this dollar route. It's an automatically injected object on the component. It's automatically there. Any component has access to the router. How does it get access to the router? Using this built-in object that will magically be injected by Vue.js. And from that built-in object, you can get the parameters passed to this component. So you can pass parameters to a component through the URL. If you look here, this link will be going to simple calculator with two parameters, 10 for A and 5 for B. So if I click here, 10 and 5. Last thing I want to show you in terms of a router, you can also ask the router to go to certain URL programmatically. In here, I'm not doing it programmatically. This is declaratively. When I click a link, it will jump to one of the components. I want to navigate to another link programmatically. When this button is clicked, I want to tell the router, please go to component to this particular URL. It could be that, for example, after I log in, if I am a parent, the system should take me to the parent, let's say to the parent component. If I'm a teacher, it should take me to the teacher component. Yes, there will be some logic to route the user. So you have to do some to route the user programmatically. So to do this is very super simple. And the way you do it is, here it is. So if I go to simple calculator, here, there is a button here. When this button is clicked, which method I will be calling? Open calculator. And what this open calculator does, it just goes to the built-in router object, and then it calls this method push, and it gives it the path or the URL to which it will go to. And this will route, the router will navigate to this URL. So this is how to programmatically access the router. So to summarize, these are two major programmatic access to the router. The router is available to any component. You just go to this $router, you get access to the router. You can either use it to navigate to another URL, or you can use it to read parameters coming from the route, from the link that landed you to this component, in this component. When a component has a life cycle, when the component loads, there is one event called created. In there, you can put some initialization that you wish. It is a good point. You can make use of, when the component is created, you can read the parameters coming in the route, and you can initialize the component. Maybe you go to the server and fetch some data using Web API, or do some other things. But in our case, it was very simple. We didn't need to do any sophisticated logic. We only used the params to initialize our properties. I could use it here, or I could move this code to under created function. So this is a good point. I can do this initialization in a special method called created. And in here, I can do this initialization. This one and this one are equivalent. What I want to show you here, in the forms, you're already familiar with forms. You use view model to bind the properties of the object with the elements of the form. So one thing that is very common when you build a user interface is to do some validation of the input. Of course, you can use HTML basic validators that come with the input field, but it's not as flexible and as especially if you want to do some custom validation, your own validation, or you want to do some sophisticated reporting of error messages and so on. So instead, you could use, of course, the built-in validators that come with input, or you can use a plugin, a popular plugin with Vue.js. It's called Vue.js. Vue.js, and you can install it, you can import it, and let Vue be aware of it. So you import it and make Vue aware of it. And then the good thing is, in the object associated with the component, you can have a property called validations, and you can define your validations here. So instead of putting your validations in the UI, in the template, you put them here declaratively. For example, in here, the name is required, the minimum length is 4, the age should be between 20 and 80, for example. Then what this Vue.js component gives you, it adds a special attribute called $V. And this $V, what it allows you to do, you can access some very useful properties to say, for example, is my view, is the data associated with my view, is it valid or not valid? So if it violates any of the rules that you have set up in the validation rules, this property $V dash dot $invalid, this $V and $invalid, these are extra properties automatically added by Vue.js to your component. So if you do dash $V dot $invalid, if there is any error, this will be true. And then what you can do, you can disable the submit button. So the submit button will be disabled until there are no errors in the input fields. So this declaratively, you can do something very nice like this. You can also display some errors if one of the inputs is invalid. So here are my validations. Some simple validations, the name is required, the hypertype is required. And also I can do custom validation. So for codes, there is no simple validation to validate that every code must have some text. So what I'm doing here, I'm creating a custom validator. Custom validator is nothing but a function. So look at this function, what it does. All it does, it will look through. If there are no codes, then the codes are valid. If there are codes, it will look through them and see if there is any of the codes is empty. If it is empty, it will basically return false. So if any of the codes because a hierarchy has one or many codes, if any of them is empty, then basically the code's property is invalid, and the whole form, the submit button, will be disabled.